Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It's good to see some familiar names and faces. Feel free to come on camera. And we encourage participation today. So it's always nice to see your faces while we're presenting and engaging in some dialogue here today. So we will give it just another 30 seconds or so, minute, and then we will get started. Thank you guys for joining us today. Okay, still got some folks joining us, so I said we'll just give it just another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll get started. Okay. Okay, well, I will go ahead and get us started today because I know we've got a good presentation here, and we want to give you guys as much time as possible for the presentation and dialogue. So I'll go ahead and get us started. So thank you guys again for joining us today for CLARB's Leadership Development webinar. This is a series that we started about a little over 2 years ago, and we found it's really important for us. It's a program that helps us to provide leadership development opportunities for our members and our customers. And our future leadership, hopefully. So we believe in investing in you guys as our current and future volunteers. It's really one of the best ways we can ensure the future success of CLARB as an organization. So, that strong leadership really empowers CLARB's vision and mission and values. And so thank you guys for joining us here today. Our topic today is critical thinking in a BANI world. And we're excited that you guys are here with us today. And with that, before we start, just a couple of reminders. Hopefully were muted as you came in. We will have times throughout this presentation where you can unmute, and we really encourage you guys to engage with us today. But if you're not speaking, please keep yourself muted to minimize the background noise. We will be monitoring the chat throughout today, so feel free to use the chat as well. We are recording, and we will send, if you have to leave us early today, we understand. We hope you stay, but if you need to leave, we will be sending the recording out to everybody who registered for today's webinar, and you can enable closed captioning if you would like as well. So, and then today's presenter, we have Jeff DeCania here with us today. He is executive advisor of Foresight First, and he is a long time partner with CLARB. We've worked with Jeff for, I was just saying, many, many years, and always are excited to hear what he has to present on. So welcome, Jeff. Thank you for being here today, and I will turn things over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Andrea, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to work with you and with CLARB on this session. And thank you, everyone who is attending today, all of you who are here. And I want to also thank anyone who will be watching the recording of this. I hope you'll find value in that as well. And, we've got an important conversation today, critical thinking in a BANI world. And as Andrea said, we're going to have a couple of opportunities for question and response a little bit later. But before we do that, just a couple of things I want to say before we have you move into a breakout conversation with one another so you can start to build your connections with the people who are participating in this webinar today. So first thing is a request, please do not use AI during our webinar. If you reviewed the preparation presentation, you saw my request there, and I'm reiterating it as well. I'm working hard to keep these kinds of sessions to be human learning experiences, not mediated by AI, and particularly when we're talking about something like critical thinking, it's important for us to maintain that focus on the human being as opposed to the tech. So I appreciate you honoring that request. Today is day 2171 of the Turbulent 20s, so we are progressing on a day-by-day basis toward the 2030s. And we're looking at another little over 4 years, 48 months remaining in this decade that we'll have to navigate. And so our conversation is very important, takes on added significance in the context of where we are and where we're headed, the importance of our critical thinking skills and building those up and continuing to strengthen them. And we're going to talk about that today in quite a bit of detail. As Andrea mentioned, CLARB is very committed to intentional learning, which is part of the reason why I like working with them because I am too. And we know that it is a non-negotiable requirement. It has been in this decade. It continues to be. And spoiler alert, it will be in the next decade as well. So I'm sure that all of you are here in part for that reason, because you are intentional learners. You have a relationship with CLARB. You know about what the organization is about. But what we want to do really is get to a clearer understanding of why you are here today, specifically for this webinar. And then we're going to have you respond to a poll that Andrea is going to put up right now. And we'll give you a minute or so to respond to the poll. And so you can see the four options that are up there, and we'll ask you to choose the one that best reflects your primary motivation for participating in this webinar. And then once the poll has been completed, we will have you move into a breakout room for a conversation with other participants in this session. So please go ahead and complete the poll, and then we'll see, and I'll give you some guidance on what the purpose of the poll or what the conversation is that you will have with your colleagues in the breakout room. So let's just give it another 15 seconds or so for the poll before it closes, and then we will move forward with the breakout room. So go ahead and respond if you have not yet responded to the poll. And interesting responses, mostly people here to strengthen their critical thinking skills specifically. Some here because they're looking for opportunities to build their enduring human skills, which we will talk about today. And I appreciate the honesty of the person who voted their concern that frequent AI use is eroding their critical thinking skills. So that is a candid admission that we appreciate. So let's go ahead and end the poll, see the final results, and just want you to take a look at that. If you want to grab a screenshot of that, because we are going to move you into the breakout room to talk about it. So, more than two-thirds strengthening critical thinking skills, about 25, about a quarter here for a broader sort of look at enduring human skills, and then one person talking about how AI may be eroding their critical thinking skills. So here's what we're going to do now. We're going to move to the breakout room. We're going to have you have a 6-minute conversation in the breakout room, and we'll ask everyone in the breakout room to share why they specifically chose to be here. So you can share your reason, what you voted, and then also your reaction to the poll, whatever reaction you might have. And then we will come back together after your 6-minute breakout room to have a bit of feedback, a bit of reporting informally from all of you before we move on with the rest of the presentation. So, Andrea, if you could move everyone into their breakout rooms, and we can get started with their small group conversation. Okay, well, looks like everyone is coming back in from the breakout rooms. And so let's take a few minutes and talk about what you discussed in the breakout room. I can't see everyone on my Zoom, so if you can raise your hand, I would appreciate that. That would be great. And I think you can probably do that under uh, the three dots of the on the side there. But let's hear from some people about what you talked about in your breakout rooms, why you're here, what others said. Just like to hear some of the conversation. And if you can't find the raise hand thing, then just go ahead and come off your mute and start talking. That's fine too.
John Roshinsky here. I One of the things I brought up is just the fact that there's so much information overload these days that it's almost impossible to discern what's important, what's not, what's real, what's not, and be able to um, utilize what thought process we do have at our disposal to discern between all of that and make informed and critical judgments.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, John, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the next section. But yes, that is a huge issue, and why the issues around critical thinking have become, among others, why it's become so important. Just in the it's always been important, but taking on added significance in the last several years. Thank you for sharing. Someone else like to share? Anyone hear anything in your breakout group that surprised you or gave you something different to think about? Just kind of curious, what the conversations were like.
They were kind of short, to tell you the truth.
Okay.
we got to introduce ourselves and and find out how miserably cold Edmonton is. Having lived there, I can say I understand. And then it seems like there's a mishmash of how much AI folks are using, and that was what I was.
Okay.
Is that fair, everybody else?
Okay. Well, good. If there's nothing else, then I appreciate the fact. I wanted to give you a chance to, kind of interact with each other a little bit and to talk a little bit about this. We will have opportunities, as I mentioned earlier, later on in the webinar to have question and response, and I'll talk more about that when we get there. So let's proceed with our conversation and get into the first part of the discussion. So the title of this session is Critical Thinking in a BANI World, and I've talked a little bit about the BANI world in the preparation presentation. I want to talk a little bit more about it here, and specifically the question, why is living in this environment creating cognitive challenges for all human beings? And get into that in some detail. And as I mentioned also in the preparation presentation, I think that the question that I'm asking, the question we should all be asking ourselves as we think about the contributions that we are making to the world, both professionally and personally, is what will our successors say about us? And I think that adds another dimension to the discussion around critical thinking, that we're not just doing it for ourselves, we're doing it for other people as well. We are trying to leave whatever it is we're working on, an organization, an issue, a project, our lives and families and communities. We're trying to leave them better than how we found them, so that those who will follow us will benefit from what we do. And so, when I when I pose this question, the bulk of the work that I do is with boards of directors. I pose this question to them, and I pose it to, other groups, and really it's also an individual question. The people who are going to follow us in the decades ahead, people that we will never know personally. what will they say about what we did or didn't do at this time in 2025, 2026? So again, I just think it amplifies the importance of our focus on so many things, and critical thinking is certainly right at the top of that list. So it's just something to keep in mind as we go through our conversation, that we're doing this for ourselves. Of course, we're doing it to support our and to advance, things we prioritize today. But there is also an important future aspect to this that we can't ignore in this conversation, that we really should embrace as part of this discussion. So just by way of background, some of you may be familiar with this, but we for decades now, we have been using a different framework, or many people have been using a different framework that is abbreviated VUCA, and probably many of you are familiar with VUCA, and it got its start in the 80s and early 90s. It found its way into the U.S. Army War College, and then sort of expanded. Beyond that, it wasn't didn't originate in the military, but it became something that was very well used and adopted in the military, and then it expanded to other sectors. And it's an acronym that stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, to characterize and describe the environment in which we were operating, particularly from the military context in the aftermath of the Cold War. And so that the world, was one of the things about the Cold War is that the world was very predictable, or at least a little bit more predictable. And there was less uncertainty, and maybe it was a little less complexity, less ambiguity. And then in the aftermath, there were a lot more questions and a lot more challenges. And this framework was helpful for a very long time. But as volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity got baked in, those conditions became baked into many of the issues that we were grappling with. In 2018, the futurist Jermaine Cascio proposed an alternative framework that, to his mind, better described and was more useful in terms of trying to understand the environment in which we're operating. And again, this is pre-pandemic, but I think since the pandemic occurred, since the beginning of 2020, we have found that this framework has been very useful in evaluating, kind of where we are, the BANI framework. And so the BANI framework proposes four different ways of looking at things. First, looking at, what's brittle, and particularly the brittleness of systems that sometimes appear to be strong, but actually are brittle underneath. And certainly there's no question that the pandemic took many systems, both human systems, physical systems, and even systems of ideas like democracy and so on, were rendered brittle, or were weakened as a result of putting them under stress during the time of the pandemic. There's quite a bit of anxiety that we have experienced, even before the pandemic, but certainly throughout this decade. I'll talk more about that on the next slide. A growing sense of a lack of predictability in the environment, so more nonlinear sort of outcomes in the way that things are unfolding, and more challenges that feel so difficult to solve because you really don't know where to start, that we describe them as incomprehensible. And so these four dynamics, these four conditions, if you will, present a different way of looking at things. And you can certainly, when you look around at what's happening, you can certainly see how these conditions are manifesting themselves in the environment. And as we look toward the 2030s, there's good reason to believe that not only will these conditions persist as we look at the multiple crises that are happening right now. In my work as a advisor to boards, to in being a foresight practitioner, I certainly devote a lot of my attention to understanding what the dynamics of the environment are by doing a lot of ongoing scanning. And I see these conditions popping up all the time, where systems are, if not collapsing, they are certainly getting weaker, or whether we are seeing more anxiety among human beings across the board, whether we're seeing more nonlinearity, more difficult challenges. So we're definitely seeing this manifest itself, and I think that that's going to continue and be intensified as we move toward the 2030s. So when we think about this in the context of our overarching focus today on critical thinking. I think one of the things that I said I would talk more about anxiety. This is actually the aspect of BANI that in many ways I worry most about in terms of the human impact of what we're dealing with right now. So we can certainly say, I think, and see that it's happening. That anxiety has been building throughout this decade. There was so much anxiety in throughout the first couple of years as we moved into an unexpected, although not unforeseeable, global health emergency. That anxiety has continued. There's a lot of unprocessed emotion and a lot of unprocessed feelings coming out of that, even though we're in a very different place now. COVID has not gone away. It's gone to a different place, but it is still present and it's going to be present. And, there was a lot of pain in that period, a lot of suffering. We lost a lot of people in the United States and around the world as a result of COVID. And so what has happened is, I think in these last 2,100, almost 2,180 days, is that trauma from not just from COVID, but from sort of the follow-on consequences of a pandemic has become embedded in our human systems, and we have not really found a way to deal with it. And yet we recognize how that's unfolding. We recognize that there's, for example, a loneliness epidemic in the United States. People are more isolated than they've ever been before. And we see the concerns about substance abuse that are present there, even though some metrics have gone down. Overall, there's still quite a bit of substance abuse. We see people, seeking mental health treatment, which is a good thing, but a lot of people are doing it, and that is the number one way that people are using AI right now is to seek out therapy and companionship, even though many of the tools they're using, the services that they are using, are not really designed for that, and it has caused problems in that regard. So we're dealing with anxiety that has been building, continues to build, and has become deeply embedded in the human systems, in the people and in the systems within which they operate. And that's a factor when we are looking at something like critical thinking. People are operating in an environment where it's more challenging to engage in that. I think also that there's no question, at least to my mind, I look around at how AI is being used, that generative AI itself, like it's certainly one of the issues that contributes to an overall context of BANI, but itself in its own way has become kind of an accelerant for BANI conditions. It has made systems, more brittle in many ways because there's, to John's point earlier, there's more misinformation and disinformation in the environment. It's very cheap to create that using generative AI and particularly LLMs, although it can exist also in other kinds of generative AI platforms and services. So, there's the brittleness factor that AI creates. We've talked about the anxiety factor, people turning to AI and not always having the best results. We see, people are going on AI and experiencing not only sycophancy, but sometimes the AI itself is encouraging them to do things that it would be self-harm, and it has had tragic consequences in some situations. And we don't really know exactly how this is going to unfold. So there is a sort of strong sense of nonlinearity in what's happening with AI. No one seems to have, good answers, for example, about exactly how this is going to affect work. We have lots of pronouncements and predictions, but there's data that supports a variety of conclusions. And we have to remember that we're using a technology that in and of itself remains largely incomprehensible to most people in terms of the way that it functions. And even people who work on it report that they don't always fully understand what is happening. So these are issues embedded specifically within generative AI that contribute to deepening and expanding these BANI conditions just for that set of technologies, that sort of frame itself. So I think that because of these many, many challenges that have been happening out there, AI, climate crisis, the divisions that we have within our own country and around the world, the sort of polarization and the sense of isolation and Economic concerns, the uncertainties around how the economy is going to continue. Will we enter a recession in 2026? The political moment, all the forces and factors that I look at, social, technological, economic, environmental, and political, you know, have real cognitive impact on people. How do we keep up with all of this? How do we maintain, as John said, how do we maintain our ability to think through and address these issues? And it is pushing many people into survival mode. And what I mean by that is, just simply kind of scrolling through stuff, doom scrolling, and trying to manage, their thinking about, where things are headed, and sometimes just unplugging completely from that, not wanting to be too engaged in conversations around things, falling into isolation, and stepping back from the environment. And that means that people are now in coping mode around a lot of this. And coping is, although obviously if people have mental health challenges, they have to find ways to deal with them. So I don't want to be too critical of the idea that people need coping mechanisms so they can continue to lead their lives. But we can't rely entirely on the idea that we're just going to cope with these challenges. We also have to be able to address the issues that are in play here, and that requires our critical thinking. So against the flow of all these conditions that are out there that people are experiencing, it's important for us to recognize that our capacity for critical thinking is a major factor in being able to move beyond simply coping with all this complexity, all of the BANI conditions that are out there, so that we are not, struggling with the challenges that are there, which unfortunately is a bigger factor today than perhaps we've seen in quite a long time. So let's take a moment here and pause, and we're doing question and response. So question and response is I'm giving you a question, which you see on the slide here, and I encourage you to respond to this question either in the chat, or you can go off mute and share your thoughts on camera. But this is also the time when we're opening up the opportunity for questions from all of you for what we've talked about so far before we move on to the next step in our conversation. So, your thoughts on this question, again, put them in the chat, or share them with us over your microphone. And then you can also ask a question of me if you would like to do so. So let's do that now for a few minutes. What are your thoughts on this question? Anyone would like to share what your thoughts on this question are, or ask a question of your own?
Yeah, I'm going to be really upfront and say I'm still challenged by this whole BANI concept. I didn't even know about VUCA. So there you go. So when I read this, I thought, well, this sounds interesting. I'm going to try to learn something about what they're talking about, and maybe it'll challenge my brain a bit. But I'm not really sure what cognitive challenges I'm navigating, or maybe you're navigating. But what maybe I'm not aware of those, and that I am navigating them and I haven't identified them. So this is where I am. I'm not really sure how to answer that question because I don't really know the topic that well. I don't seem to have a lot of information. I will put out like a little quickie. I had a work colleague that we were talking about health. Something came up and I wasn't doing well, and I said something about I made the mistake of having taken said I took a vaccine, a flu vaccine or whatever. And he said, well, there's your first problem, right? And then there was this whole discussion about, flu vaccines, and, he didn't take them. He didn't believe in them. I said, it's not a religion to believe in. It's science. Anyway, it kind of went downhill from there, that conversation. Then there
Well,
were
there
some
you have it.
apologies. Yeah. So maybe is that, yeah.
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 There you have it.
So,
So let's talk about that because, and I didn't take it to that level, but we can do it,
okay.
right? Which is, an example of the cognitive challenge that many of us are grappling with is this need to relitigate things that we have already kind of established, as, grounded in evidence, grounded in science, like vaccines, right? And now our conversations are different because we don't know what the flashpoint is for a discussion about something like that, and
Right.
that is part of an environment. It may not be something that we would directly attribute to BANI, but we are still operating in an environment where those systems around healthcare, for example, have been made more brittle in part because ideological views and political, policy decision making has changed public views of what has been accepted science for a very long time. And there is misinformation and disinformation in the environment that some people are accepting as true. That creates a different conversation around things that we all at one time, were able to agree on that it was important for all of us to be properly vaccinated against whatever illness was, including COVID. And, now that issue is extending, at least in the US, it's extending to vaccine recommendations for children. And so, yeah, so that is actually a really good example of the kind of thing that we're talking about. That is a cognitive challenge, and that's just one issue. That's a cognitive
Right.
challenge that we are now all facing more acutely than we did, maybe a decade ago, right? Because so much has shifted in this environment over the course of the last, 6 to 10 years.
Yeah. So my navigation through that was pretty abysmal. I don't know if I crashed or if it's a sailing ship. I lost it. I don't know how to even explain it. I mean, I was angry that he was being an idiot and not even, yeah. So I don't even know how to navigate that. I can't change what I think is stupid. Like I can't fix stupid. Sorry. I know that sounds really silly, but I just don't know how to navigate through that. And
Well,
because
yeah,
my parents are medical background, so my dad was a doctor, my mom was a nurse, my partner's a pharmacist and educated and blah blah blah. So I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. You take the vaccine, you have a cut, you put a band-aid on it. Hello, maybe put something, like I mean, it just
yeah.
so yeah,
Yeah, and I think the challenge for all of us will be, that one feels probably more, clear to us in terms of what we might think versus what others might think on an issue like that related to health and, related to accepted science and that sort of thing. I think where it becomes more difficult is when we start addressing issues where maybe it doesn't feel quite so, clear cut, where maybe there are views that we have to look at, where we have to consider the veracity of different statements, things that we'll talk about in the next section. So I think that, it's an important thing for us to reflect on is, how much, and it's an energy issue, it's an attention issue, how do we make sure that we are focusing on the right conversations in the right way, as opposed to allowing ourselves to become distracted by challenges that have emerged as a result of people's the difficulty that they feel operating under these conditions. It may not be affecting you in the same way that it's affecting others, but it's now an aspect of our environment that we have to just maintain an awareness of and think about how do we navigate that ourselves on an ongoing basis. So I appreciate you sharing your experience there. And there were several comments in the chat which I really appreciated, and when I want to encourage people to bring them up, when we have our next Q&R period in just a few minutes. I want to walk you through, the next part of this and add some more context to this conversation, and really get into the issue of critical thinking and what it requires of us, sort of building on what we just talked about and get into some additional thoughts on this, and then we'll come back for more discussion. So I think that, on a big picture, and I'm glad that so many people responded on the survey that they are looking for ways to build their enduring human skills. If I'd written this survey different, or excuse me, written this slide differently, it might have read, to become future proof, we must build soft skills. But neither of those terms are good anymore. Those are not good terms. Future proof is not something that any of us can become, even though lots of people are selling that idea. We can't proof ourselves against the future. We can become more adaptive to the challenges of the future. Soft skills is a very terrible term that really has no meaning anymore. It's really about enduring human skills. What are the fundamental skills that we have to be able to build as human beings that we can sustain over time? And that includes critical thinking. It also includes communication and creativity. It includes innovation and collaboration. But it's not just about skills. It's also about networks. It's also about building relationships with people. The skills that we build are going to be very useful for us in a variety of ways. They'll be useful for us at work, and they will have use for us in our lives. But we're not going to be as human beings just a collection of skills. It's also going to be about how do we build relationships with people who can support us and help us in this process of building our skills and being, leading our lives. So to facilitate this idea that we are building enduring human skills and networks, we're going to continue the building of skills around critical thinking in this conversation. But I want to invite everyone right now. This generally happens informally in most sessions that I'm in, whether I'm the facilitator or I'm a participant. But I want to invite everyone to put your LinkedIn information into the chat right now, so that you can begin to begin the process of connecting with everyone who is a part of this webinar today. Because the more that you can build relationships with people who share your concerns, share your interests, share experiences like this one with you, the better that you will have the ability to reach out to them in the future. So I wanted to create this space within the framework of our conversations to say, go ahead and start connecting with people. In fact, I'm going to do it myself, so that we can all be connected. I hope you will reach out. This URL will actually also be at the end of the webinar on my final slide. But I have my own URL, which I understand LinkedIn does not like the fact that people have their own URLs, but the LinkedIn police have not knocked on my door. So I'm just going to keep on using it. It's a little bit easier for people to find. But please, yeah, go ahead and put in your LinkedIn information and get connected with each other as part of this conversation, because I think that you'll find value in having that continuing connection. So what I want to walk you through now as part of, how do we begin to really build, our our critical thinking skills, is a framework that I use that it's started out as really being about intentional learning, but which I talked about earlier, but the two really go together very well within the context of this framework. And so I want to talk you through this framework and help you see how it can be applied to a critical thinking way of approaching conversations, a way of approaching your own sort of inquiry into issues, so that you can, in fact, come out on the back end of this with a strong sense that this has been about critical thinking. And so I call it the foresight first learning cycle, but again, it goes beyond that. So I want to start, with the sense making part of things, because in an intentional learning process, the sense making aspect of this is really about doing exactly the thing that we need to be able to do with critical thinking. We need to be able to really understand what it is we are talking about, and do we have a supportable understanding of what the issue is, and one that is converse or be verifiable with evidence and is fact-based. And to be able to build that, based upon a sense of confidence and trust in the sources that we are looking at, and looking at a variety of pieces of information that help us build that understanding, and that it's not something that is going to be characterized by misinformation or by something that's simply inaccurate. And so the focus of sense making, what could be, is really about that exploration of getting to that understanding so that we can act upon it, we can do something with it. And that is foundational to the idea of critical thinking. What's the structure of the thinking that we're bringing to the table, and how do we know what we know? And how do we make sure that we can feel confident in that? And even if we have, places where we have gaps, knowing how to get at that information is also part of the sense-making process. So when we go through sense-making, we are not only learning, but we are also, to use a word that came up earlier, we're also discerning. We're using our discernment around what is factual information, what is good information, how do we apply that to build our understanding on whatever the issue might be. And so we start with sense making, and we take our sense making process to another step, which is the meaning making process. Now, there's a lot of conversation about, sense making, meaning making go together. They can sort of fall under the same umbrella of sense making as just one thing. I think it's useful to break it out and see them represented separately. And so that whereas sense making is about building that understanding, that capacity to know that we've got information and ideas and resources that we can act on with confidence. But then meaning making is really about understanding the implications of all of that. And the implications are not just short-term implications, but also long-term implications. And that too is part of critical thinking. How do we discern, once again, our ability to recognize what is the short-term choice that we might be making or the short-term issue we might be confronting, and what are the long-term issues? And that's, again, where thinking about our successors comes into play in this conversation. So it's a very important aspect of the process. And with meaning making, what we're really looking at is not just some of the core things that we might consider. We might consider what are the financial implications, for example, or some of the sort of strategic implications, but also reputational implications of what we understand, and that too, how do we critically tease out what those issues are? The same thing with ethical implications, human implications. What's the effect of what we might be looking at on people in the short term, in the long term? So we want to look at multiple horizons and then also through multiple lenses to give us a more holistic perspective on that. And then there's decision making, which I'm going to talk more about in the final section of the webinar. But for now, what I'll say is that, what we're really doing with, decision making is we're taking what we learn through our sense making processes. And all this, by the way, is intentional, right? Where we're trying to bring intention to this process, even though this cycle of sense making, meaning making, decision making is something we do quite naturally. We do it over and over again without realizing that's what it is, without actually naming it. We're doing it every day, every minute really of every day. We want to make sure that we are approaching decision making with the clarity of, okay, how do we understand what we've been talking about? Have we really delved into understand better what the issues are, and we have confidence in that understanding? Do we have a good perspective on what the implications of the issue are? And we've teased that out. And then, excuse me, then we get to the critical thinking aspect of decision making, the what if we, what are the choices that we're going to make around this? And then we do that, as I said, do that over and over again. There's a cycle that we repeat over and over again on a regular basis. And I'm going to talk more about, as I said, talk about decision making a little bit more in the next section. So when we talk about what critical thinking requires of us, I've got a few points on the next couple of slides to make. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold, so I've got a little bit of a scratchy throat. I think the first thing, and really a very important aspect of this, is accepting the need for friction as we work through that cycle. When I described that to you on the previous slide, one of the things that I didn't say is that, all of that requires effort, right? It requires energy, and it requires our willingness to stay with it to make sure that we are getting to the right outcomes in each one of those phases. And we have become a lot more accustomed to processes being frictionless. That's one of the promises of technology. That's one of the things that AI has offered to us, is that we can put in a prompt and get a very fluid sounding response, even though it may contain information that is inaccurate, but it reads well and it's persuasive, it's convincing, but not always completely. It's often hallucinatory or confabulates. So that frictionless option is appealing, but it can't do the work for us, right? And that's one of the, I didn't mention this earlier, but that's one of the issues that we're grappling with regard to critical thinking, of people offloading their thinking to AI. And because it feels so easy, it feels so simple, you can do it, on your phone, you can get, a decent output for whatever it is you're trying to do, write a report, write an email, create marketing content, whatever it might be. And we need to accept the fact that our critical thinking effort is going to be an effort, it is going to include friction. And we're not always going to have the easiest and smoothest glide path through that work. But the benefit of it is that we're going to get a better result as a consequence of going through this process. We will benefit and our outcomes will benefit. So starting from the place of accepting friction is important because if we can't do that, it's going to be very hard to sustain the rest of the steps, the rest of the aspect of this work. I think one of the other things that is very much an issue that I worry about is the ongoing, fragmentation of our attention, which is not an AI thing specifically. It's actually more of a mobile thing. Mobile has really had detrimental effects on our ability to focus, except on the screen, right? I can't count the number of near misses I've had with people in airports who are fixated on their screens and almost run into you. And it happens all the time. And we're spending so much time on screens that we're devoting all of our attention there, and we're devoting our attention to very small amounts of information that can be read on that size screen. Our attention has now been reshaped in many ways. Our brains have been reshaped to focus on that kind of format, that sort of short video, short content format. And we've got to reclaim our attention to be able to deal with different kinds of information and refocus our attention in every phase of this cycle, in every phase of our learning process, and every phase of critical thinking. Because if we continue to allow the fragmentation of our attention, then it's going to be a lot harder for us to be able to engage in some kind of really meaningful critical thinking process. So, and really, I think in some ways, these first two go hand in hand because if we can accept, and sort of go along with the idea that there's going to be need for friction, then maybe we can do a better job of saying, okay, I've got to focus on this. I've got to be able to retrain my brain in a sense to be able to get outside of I can only consume things that are about 3 minutes or less and be able to read more fully and get more information because that's how we're going to be able to determine whether or not something is part of a supportable understanding for our critical thinking process. And then, obviously this is all a process of inquiry. It starts with asking questions and different questions of ourselves and of the sources that we're looking at and of the people who are making arguments, and really probing into how they got to where they are in their thinking. And I think it's really beneficial if those processes, that inquiry process, starts with humility on our part. I think it's really powerful. Part of what I love about my work and my job is that I say I don't know many times per day. And having the humility to approach the conversation from that place of not knowing is going to absolutely help us be better critical thinkers. Because if we go into it believing that we know, then we might be able to take a shortcut and then we skip the friction of actually thinking and get down to what's the result. And, I think all of this clearly is a challenge because everyone feels a lot busier today than they ever have been. They're doing a lot more. We're all looking at our calendars all the time, trying to figure out where there's free moments. So it requires us to, sort of look at this differently. And a good place to start is bringing that humility of being able to say, I don't know, and then backing that up with the curiosity that is required to do, the necessary kind of inquiry into the conversation, right? So if we're saying, well, I don't know, but I'm going to find out, and I'm going to look for things that are going to support my understanding, that's good. And then finally sort of building on both of those, right? The humility of not knowing, the curiosity to discover, and then the ability to reflect. And this goes right back up to the need for friction, the need for focusing attention. Part of the reason why, in our preparation presentation, I gave you reflection questions is not just so that you could come to this session having thought about why you were here, having thought about the challenges you're facing, but also to invite you to bring reflection into your daily practice, in everything you're doing professionally or personally. Because the more that we can sort of get accustomed again to making reflection a daily priority, an ongoing focus. It will help us with focusing attention. It will help us with overcoming that desire for a frictionless experience in every situation. And it will help us get to a better set of questions that will facilitate our critical thinking. Because in critical thinking, we are going to be doing lots and lots of reflection on what it is we are looking at, reflecting on implications and reflecting on the veracity, the truth of resources that we're consulting. So there are no shortcuts in any of this. There's just getting to a better practice that we need to embed in what we're doing. And then part two of this, what it requires of us. You could put these in any order that suits you, but I think all six of these things are what's required of us. I'm just sharing them with you in a way that makes sense to me. I think that we are going to be continuously, we're doing it now, whether we realize it or not. Just today, I'll give you an example of how I did this just today. You may have heard that Time magazine named the so-called architects of AI as their person of the year. And that includes people like Musk and Altman and others. When I first saw this online, I stopped for 3 minutes to determine whether or not it was true, right? I'm looking at the visual on LinkedIn to say, okay, that doesn't look real to me. Is this just a speculation? Did someone create a AI generated visual to put up here just to have a little fun with us on it? And I had to go out and sort of look around to make sure to confirm that that was actually true, right? And of course, it is true. Whether or not I agree with it is another matter, but it required the additional step rather than just accepting to say, okay, is this in fact what's happening here, right? So let's make sure that we're evaluating ideas, we're evaluating information, we're evaluating sources, right? So those sources might be people, those sources might be institutions, and we're trying to evaluate is what is being shared accurate? Is it trustworthy, right? Like I think so many institutions now are claiming that in this environment of AI that they are trustworthy. Well, they have to prove that. And we have to challenge them to prove that in the way that they talk about things, the way they share things. And then what are the real world implications of what we're looking at? That too is part of critical thinking. If information is being shared, how do we tease out what that means, in terms of the actual impact on people, on institutions, on society, and so on our work? We always have to be examining underlying beliefs, our own underlying beliefs, the beliefs of other people. In past sessions for CLARB, I've talked a lot about, some of you may have attended sessions I've done on orthodox beliefs, the deep-seated assumptions we make about how the world works. Our own orthodoxy and the orthodoxy of others influences our ability to evaluate the information that's being shared and could evaluate or could influence the way that they are sharing that. So looking at our orthodoxy, looking at the orthodoxy of others, thinking and acting beyond orthodoxy is in its own right a form of critical thinking that is part of the larger process as well. And I think that what we always want to be able to do as we work through each one of these aspects of critical thinking and understand how they play into what we do or play into our work and to our lives is that we have to be adaptive in our critical thinking to new information, right? We may have gone through looking at certain ideas or information or sources, and then new information emerges. The context shifts for whatever reason, new developments occur. So it has to be something that is adaptive to what's happening in the environment. It can't be a static process. It has to be a dynamic process as well. So those are the six things that I wanted to share with you about what critical thinking requires of us. And I want to pick up on this adaptation point in our Q&R period here to ask you, how do you think you can adapt your sense making and your meaning making to strengthen critical thinking? So you can respond to this question in the chat, or you can do so, just come off mute and share your thought. Or if you've got a question for me, I'm also happy to answer that now and take some questions for a few minutes before we move to the final part of our conversation today.
Well, this is John Roshinsky again. I think what's coming up for me is my assumptions. because they're based on my life experience and what I've learned over time. And so I think for myself, in order to strengthen my critical thinking, is I have to pay more attention to those assumptions and try to figure out where I need to change that. And so a question that I have for you would be, um, I mean, in some respects, how is that even possible? Because, like you said, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. So all we have to rely on is basically what our experiences from the past have been.
Mhm. Yeah. So I think a way, I was mentioning a moment ago that one of the things I've talked about in the past for CLARB is thinking and acting beyond orthodoxy. That was, in fact, the topic of my webinar last December. And it speaks directly to this issue of assumptions, because that's what orthodoxy is, deep-seated assumptions we make about how the world works. And I think, I've been talking about it for a long time. So for me, it is something that has become very ingrained in the way that I look at things, but it is still something we can practice. And so my advice to you, John, and to everyone really is to practice in the following way, which is to just look around at what is happening, in your part of the world, right? What you're experiencing, and intentionally look for the disconnects between what you're seeing and what your assumptions are, maintaining that awareness that what you hold as true and helpful is not necessarily showing up in what you see or what people say or what you're reading. Like, you can find it in a lot of different places. Where are those disconnects? Because that's the starting point for saying, you know what, maybe what I'm thinking is actually orthodoxy. Maybe what I'm saying is orthodoxy. So if we take that personal responsibility of saying, you know what, I'm going to maintain the awareness that I'm holding on to beliefs that may actually no longer be true. Maybe they were never really true to begin with, but I didn't realize it because orthodoxy is something that is so prevalent. It's repeated and inculcated in us through organizational experiences, as you say, through educational experiences and other kinds of life experiences. The more that we can be intentional about looking for those disconnects between what we're experiencing right now and what we have held to be true for decades in some cases, the better off we will be in being able to surface what those orthodoxies are and then be able to challenge them, right? To really reckon with them, examine them more closely, and build that capacity for thinking and acting beyond orthodoxy. So I think if you can just start with adopting that practice, I think that's a step in the right direction. Other thoughts on this question or questions that people have before we move to the final part of our conversation this afternoon?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. Something I struggle with is that, when you look at your, struggling with assumptions, I sometimes feel though that the the there's a pull to go almost to the far side of that um, equation, where there's like go in and break stuff fast and see what happens. And we can probably agree that that often doesn't lead to, maybe on the surface and maybe sound bites makes for some interesting reading, but in the end, strategically, does it actually breed um, productive change? In some cases it does, and some it doesn't. So I struggle with that. Is that, like, if I'm finding my own orthodoxy, am I tempted then to follow some kind of charlatan that is preaching a gospel of just, right, go in and break stuff fast and then
Yeah,
let the dust settle, and I bet you it's going to turn out all right. Or if it doesn't, we can fix it or
yeah,
refix it. So I
yeah. I mean,
struggle with that.
yeah, I think I mean, I certainly would agree there's a danger that we don't want to swing entirely away from a belief system that we've held to something that is completely a field of that, something that's 180 degrees opposite of that. And so, when I'm working with a group, again, I spend a lot of time with boards talking about orthodoxy. It's never about let's just take all the orthodoxy and throw it out the window. It's more like, how do we establish what would be a justified belief, right? So the shift from orthodoxy to justified beliefs is really the way that we would go, right? Like in having a conversation about orthodoxy, for example, with a group, the thing would be, okay, what's actually true here? What's actually a good basis for moving forward versus a basis that is going to be a limiting belief? And so it's not about moving from one side, swinging the pendulum from one side to the other. It's more like moving it along from, okay, these things are orthodoxy and they're not helpful now. And these beliefs are actually justified because we can show ourselves what the evidence is to support it. And then we can adopt, our different beliefs and adapt our thinking to those beliefs. So I totally get the issue that you're raising, John. And I think that for me, it's about making a shift simply from letting go of the limiting belief to embrace a belief that is more focused on what is possible and plausible with some support for doing so, right? Rather than just buying sort of wholesale the views of someone who might not have your best interest in mind. Let's put it that way. Great questions, and thank you very much, all of you, for your thoughts on this. So, by way of wrapping up our discussion in the next 20 minutes or so, I promised that I would talk more about decision making here because I did want to unpack this because I think a lot about the decision making aspect of in the work that I do because I am working with decision making groups. And so how can we really think about critical thinking as important to the decision-making process? And we've already talked about the importance of discernment, but really, I mean, I think we can see from this conversation today, critical thinking is essential to human judgment. And right now, one of my big concerns is that we have somehow made a decision with the use of AI that human judgment is no longer as helpful and useful as having AI make judgments. And, AI doesn't make decisions or judgments on its own. It's someone has to say, we're going to let AI make those choices. So I'm a little concerned that we're thinking that AI is necessarily superior in those ways. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But I just think that, from the perspective of what we're talking about today, critical thinking and strengthening that and prioritizing that is essential to our focus on trying to build better human judgment, which we very much need in this environment for all the reasons we've been talking about here today. I like the phrase, and this was on the visual, the Foresight First learning circle that I shared earlier, learning cycle, excuse me. And it's, what if we, which I regard as the three most powerful words in the English language, because they are an invitation into a conversation that can foster better judgments, better critical thinking, better decisions, as opposed to advocacy, which would reframe this as I think that we should do this, or I think starting it out with from a position of advocacy versus a position of invitation into inquiry, into conversation, into collaboration. What if we handle it this way? And that is how we facilitate, I think, better human judgment rather than trying to bicker, which is often the default mode of decision making in organizations where people want to establish the supremacy of their position in the conversation and not look at the shared interests that we have to advance, right? So what if we is about advancing those shared interests and really focusing our judgments on how to make those interests. And I just want to give you a couple of examples of how I would frame this in the context of this very conversation about decision making, right? So, for example, we've all heard over and over again in the context of AI, the human in the loop. That is the default sort of safeguard that we have adopted for when things go wrong, right? We've just said, well, there's a human in the loop who is looking at everything, so it's going to be okay. And what really changed my mind about this, because I used to say that too, I'll be honest and admit to that I used to sort of think, okay, well, we have to make sure we're focusing on the human in the loop. I read an article a while back where someone, described the title of the article was Human in the Loop as a thought terminating cliche. And a thought terminating cliche is a form of orthodoxy, right? Thought terminating cliche is a phrase that is specifically used to try to end the conversation about whatever it is you're talking about. Another example of a thought terminating cliche is it is what it is, or let's agree to disagree. And when people say human in the loop now, it has become a way to end conversations about concerns around AI ethics and safety because people just say, oh, well, human in the loop, right? So that's the end of it. But what if we put humanity at the core of our decision making, right? Because another thing that got me shifting my perspective on this was listening to a professor who was very involved in the use of AI in autonomous weapons. And her point was, we don't talk about human in the loop when it comes to autonomous weapons because the human in the loop with autonomous weapons has maybe 20 seconds, if that, to be able to determine something. We can't talk about it that way. It's context specific human judgment and control. That's the phrase they use with in autonomous weapons. Context specific human judgment and control. And so that's a very different way of looking at things than the simple phrase human in the loop. So, what if we shifted our thinking from what amounts to a kind of band-aid for solutions in decision making and instead, at every opportunity, said, you know what, we're going to put humanity at the core. Now, that's a critical thinking conversation for our organizations. We're not going to be satisfied with simply allowing the discussion to be derailed in effect by our willingness to use what feels like a solution, but is actually not a real world solution for the issues that are in play. And instead, we challenge ourselves to say, how would we, in all of our decision making, put humanity at the core of the process to make sure that we are going to pause and engage in the critical thinking cycle that I described to you earlier before we make a decision or as part of making that decision. So I think that's a very important what if we that we could talk about. And let's build on that with the next one, right? Which is now, as I said a moment ago, we are seeing more and more push for algorithmic decision making on grounds of efficiency, on grounds of productivity, on grounds of resource concerns and so on. What can we have AI make decisions on because it can do this or that better than a human being and so on. And maybe there are some situations where that is the right choice. And what we have to do there is we have to put the right safeguards in place. And that also could be part of a discussion around humanity at the core. But what if we chose to address decision making not as a series of algorithmic outputs, but as a continuous flow of human responsibility? That ultimately, again, if we're just handing off our decision making to machines and expecting them to come up with the right result, and then we just take that and we act upon it, then we are really abdicating our responsibility as human decision makers and as human beings to make sure we are in a continuous flow of conversations around how decisions get made and that we are bringing our sense making and our meaning making to that process on an ongoing basis. Because here's the thing, AI cannot do sense making. AI cannot do meaning making. It can produce very convincing outputs, but it does not have a world understanding, a world sort of model to be able to have an understanding to be able to deliver the kind of sense making and meaning making that we can do. And yes, we have orthodox beliefs, we have biases, but we can work through those ways of thinking so that we are not uh, allowing them to control what is going on in terms of our ability to make decisions. So our continuous flow of responsibility is something that would be uniquely human and something that we can use to ensure that our decision-making processes are grounded in the critical thinking that goes along with sense making and meaning making. So for me, I think that what we want to do is try to think about how do we approach decision making in a way that is not commoditizing it with algorithmic, choices, algorithmic outputs, and instead is actually amplifying the importance and uniqueness of our humanity and what we bring to the table, especially, going through sense making and meaning making. So the way, that I sort of look at this is we look at sort of attaching, connecting, critical thinking and decision making, and going back to the cycle in full. And I've made versions of these points already, but I want to reinforce it with you before we conclude. Sense making requires us, I think, to ground our decision making in a supportable understanding, right? And there may be a role, we may choose to have a role, or give a role to the use of AI in all of that, but we can't offload that sense making to AI. We cannot offload the cognitive work of critical thinking in the form of sense making to artificial intelligence. And we also have to be mindful that we may actually be creating more work by going to AI and saying, give us an output on this. And then that output has to be reviewed to make sure it doesn't contain, garbage, basically. It's not inventing things. And that becomes the basis upon which decisions get made. And unfortunately, that is what is happening, right now. I cannot really comprehend why so many licensed professionals in the law continue to do things with AI that get them sanctioned by courts. It's happening over and over and over again, despite the fact that bar associations and courts and other institutions have said, stop doing this, right? Stop doing, they keep on doing it, right? So they are not going through a critical thinking process of sense making to avoid. I just got a link yesterday from a colleague of mine, that he sent me, the latest situation, right? There's a new mayor in Annapolis, Maryland, and one of the new mayor's first acts was to fire the city attorney because the city attorney was cited by a court for using generative AI in their filing before the court. And so this new mayor started December 1, just a matter of days into their term, fired the city attorney over that issue. It keeps happening. And all of you as landscape architects, or future landscape architects, if you're still in the process of doing your exams, you are, as licensed professionals, you want to make sure that you are paying attention, to this issue around how do we do sense making in a grounded way for decision making purposes with a supportable understanding that accompanies whatever it is we're doing. Meaning making requires us to address the decision making process using a holistic perspective. How do we consider all of the aspects of the conversation? Our supportable understanding allows us to then look at, what does this mean for every stakeholder in the process? What does this mean for our successors? How do we have a short-term, long-term view, operate in different time horizons? We're not speculating, we're using our information and our critical thinking to identify what the potential issues are so that we can look at this through a holistic lens, which brings us to a decision-making process, right? Because this is all tied together. We're doing this over and over again. It's part of our ongoing process. Where we're trying to bring wisdom, like that is also something that AI cannot produce. Every one of us possesses tacit knowledge. Every one of us possesses experiences that cannot be replicated by machine intelligence. So we're bringing wisdom, a unique kind of human wisdom, to the decision-making process based on the previous phases of this cycle, but also through the things that we embody in ourselves to shape the futures for which we're responsible, futures for ourselves, futures for our organizations, futures for our families and friends, futures for our stakeholders that we serve, for our successors. So we're doing this for a lot of people. Every decision making process is about the future. We're not deciding about the past. The past is over. We're going into every decision making process knowing that our choices are going to influence some future. It may be a very small short-term future, or maybe a very big long-term future, or something in between. But ultimately, our decision making is about where we're headed. That's why it needs the benefit of all these steps and the wisdom to be able to do so in a way that respects not just where we've been, but where we're headed, and goes beyond what algorithmic outputs are capable of delivering to us today, and likely, for at least for the foreseeable future. So just by way of closing, I want to thank again all of you for being here. I want to thank Andrea and Clarb for inviting me to be a part of the leadership development program again this year. I hope that you have found value in our conversation. And at the end, I'm going to give you, you have my LinkedIn, so I hope that you've reached out, but I'm also going to give you my email address if you have any questions that you would like to ask or follow up on anything. I'm always happy to be available to you to provide additional information and answer further questions. So we're 2,171 days into this decade. We have a little over 1,400 days left, fewer than 1,500 days. And again, I talk about this all the time in my work because for me, I find it very important to be grounded in knowing where we've been and where we're going. And I think it's useful to have this timeline in our heads, even though it may add to the pressure of knowing where we are and how few days we have before the 2030s begin. But I think if we are thinking about what we're doing here, and the importance of our critical thinking to shaping this future that still remains ahead of us, not just these 1,500 or just sub 1,500 days, but also the 2030s themselves, then I think it's a good thing for us to be having that in our minds, that this is a clock that we can add to other clocks that we carry with us and just be mindful of it. And I think, so for me, the question is, how will you use your critical thinking to make these remaining days of this decade better so that when we arrive at the 2030s, that we will be able to say that we've left it better than how we found it for those who have followed us. So I hope that you will think about this as a reflection on this session and take that away for further discussion, perhaps with others in your organizations as well. I keep coming back to what will our successors say about us because it's an extension of that idea. We want to know that our work on ourselves, our building of enduring human skills and networks, has implications beyond ourselves. That certainly we're thinking about how can we use critical thinking? How can we use the cycle that I talked about with you? How can we use the advice that I've given you about what critical thinking requires of us to address current issues, right? That is certainly an important aspect of this. But I think if we just do that, then we will not realize the full potential of what critical thinking is about in a BANI world. We are taking some measure of responsibility in whatever role we're playing to shape something for someone else. And the more that we think about what that means to them, even though they're not here to advise us or guide us to help, sort of tell us what they would like, we can still use our critical thinking as a resource, as a skill, as a mindset to be able to do something on their behalf. And I asked this question, what will our successors say about us? But really, there's a better question that we should be asking ourselves too, which is, what do our successors expect of us? There was a time when every one of us on this Zoom meeting was a successor as well. We were starting out, we were in a different phase of our lives. And we had predecessors who were responsible for what happened next and what kind of future we would have. And I think that now that so many of us are in the position of saying, we can influence that future for others. Again, it takes on that added significance of why critical thinking becomes such an important part of what we do, because we can work harder to fulfill these expectations that we know our successors have of us that we have to discern. And we can do that through the critical thinking process. We may not get it entirely right, but at least we will give ourselves a better option of understanding what those who are going to follow us are looking for from us and what they expect of us so that we can try to deliver that to them so that they have as much opportunity to succeed as we have had in our lives and careers. So I said this in the preparation presentation, and I'll reiterate it here. We owe it to our successors, we owe it to ourselves to become more capable critical thinkers, to build that enduring human skill, to build it not only into our daily work, but also into our ongoing, our lives outside of work as well, and into other aspects of what we do professionally and personally. and to think about it in terms of not just us, but our colleagues that we're working with, the networks that we're building, and our successors, and their implications, the implications for them as well. We have an opportunity to do something that really benefits them as well as ourselves, and I hope we will always try to take advantage of that opportunity. This is my favorite quote about the future. Anyone who's seen me speak before knows that I use this quite a bit. And I'm thinking a lot about this quote right now because next year, 2026, it will be 50 years. In July of 1976, Barbara Jordan spoke these words. So we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of this quote, and I'll be talking a lot more about it and its implications next year as we approach, especially as we approach the 50th anniversary. But going back to where I started, or one of the earliest things I said, that in a world, in a BANI world in which people are feeling overwhelmed by cognitive challenges created by the interplay of these dynamics, and people are pushing and being pushed towards survival mode, flight or fight is really the dynamic that's coming up. And we can't flee the future that's unfolding right now. And I hate in some ways the idea that we have to fight, but I do think that somewhere in between flight and fight is the right way to move forward. And I do believe also that critical thinking is one of the essential ways that we will be able to navigate this uncertainty that we cannot escape, and that actually we should be trying to figure out how to work for our benefit in this environment. So I hope that you will find value in thinking about Barbara Jordan's quote, because I do think that it challenges us to accept our shared responsibility for what happens next, and adds a lot more intention to our focus on critical thinking. So I want to thank you all for being here this afternoon. My email address, as I promised, is there. My LinkedIn link is there. I hope you'll connect. Always happy to be a resource to you. And again, thank you very much for being a part of the session today. And I'll turn it back over to Andrea.
Thanks, Jeff. I think in the chat there's been lots of words. Just thank you for always providing us with thought-provoking presentation. And I know from the very first time I saw you present to now, I always take away something, and I'm trying to think of, like what's the right word? Yeah, very thought-provoking, I guess is the best way to put it. So thank you, Jeff, for getting us thinking today about what could be. And for those of us, thank you guys for joining us today. We always value your feedback. So if you have just a few seconds, we really appreciate you taking some time to give us feedback on today's presentation, and also what topics do you want to see in the future. So we do look through those survey topics and see, as we're planning for future events, we take that into consideration. So it just takes 30 seconds or so, and is really helpful for us. And then last but not least, our next leadership development webinar will be in February. We're taking January off as we prepare for some IT upgrades. And so the next one, we will be bringing back an early career advice panel. We had huge success with that back in September, and so we will do another panel in February on the 25th, same time, 3 p.m. Eastern time, and we will address some different topics for early career folks that would like to join, or if either you yourself, or if you have employees that you feel like could benefit, please feel free to forward this on to them and let them know. But again, thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Jeff, for a great presentation.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care, guys.